Today I will be speaking about several vulnerabilities that we found in some Devious transfer implementations. And this is joint work with Aviv, who's a researcher at Fortify, and Ben from Miston Labs. So kind of to motivate maybe this work, I would say that there are two main approaches for threshold signatures, or specifically for ECDSA threshold signatures over the past few years. The first approach is based on homomorphic encryption, and there's like several protocols. Most recent of is the CGGMP work that follow this approach. And the second approach uses a tool called oblivious transfer. And I would say neither approach is obviously perfect, and there's different trade-offs in terms of performance, in terms of security assumptions. And in general, we've seen in last Decompute, I guess, and generally last year, we've seen several pitfalls and bugs in the TSS protocols that use homomorphic encryptions. And actually, we've seen that OT-based protocols based on oblivious transfers, are kind of perceived as being a little bit simpler, easier to understand, easier to implement, and they have been getting a bit more performant, thanks to the work of several people here in the audience. And in this work, we actually kind of take a look at some of those protocols, and we see there's kind of, in cryptography, there's no such a thing as too simple. Everything can have pitfalls, everything can have bugs, and the goal is kind of to make sure that people are aware of some of those pitfalls. I want to stress that the vulnerabilities that we found are not in the protocols themselves. So as far as we know, the protocols are secure and they have security proofs, but rather the vulnerabilities are in the implementations. In particular, two of the vulnerabilities in the oblivious transfer implementations are part of threshold signatures libraries. And in fact, those vulnerabilities in the basic OT primitive then admit attacks on the threshold signature protocol as a whole. And I want to say we disclose all the vulnerabilities to the authors who've been very responsive on working on fixing them. So thanks them for the responsiveness. So in this talk, I will kind of introduce oblivious transfer and present how to build it. We'll see kind of a recipe for constructing oblivious transfer protocols from Diffie-Hellman assumptions. And then we'll talk about two different OT protocols and specific to implementations, and we'll see a couple of bugs in those implementations, and I'll try to kind of present some takeaways from these bugs. I should just say that technically, kind of the vulnerabilities that we found, they kind of, I would say, they're based on, I would say, pretty classic pitfalls. We're dealing with elliptic curves, so some of these things are pretty classic, but I think kind of the application to oblivious transfer is nice and interesting to see. So what is oblivious transfer? So oblivious transfer is a two-party protocol between the sender and the receiver, where the sender holds two messages and the receiver holds a bit. And at the end of the protocol, the receiver learns one of these messages based on their choice bit, and the sender learns nothing. In terms of the security definition, the formal security definition is obviously you have to do it in the UC framework, and it's you have to define it precisely, but kind of informally, the way you should think about it, that the privacy with respect to the sender, meaning that the receiver must only learn one message and should not learn the other message that does not correspond to their choice bit. And privacy with respect to the receiver is that the sender must not learn the choice bit of the receiver. And this is a very fundamental cryptographic primitive. In fact, it's sufficient to build MPC protocols for any problem in the dishonest majority setting. And there are several instantiations of it based on standard cryptographic assumptions such as DDH, RSA. There's also post-quantum OT protocols as well. And kind of how do we connect oblivious transfer to, how do you build threshold ECDSA protocols from oblivious transfer? The general, I would say, recipe is that you can think about oblivious transfer as a way to multiply by a bit. So kind of the choice bit, you get to multiply by a 0 or 1. And then there's this technique called Gilboa's method, which essentially allows you, when you want to multiply two field elements, you kind of do bit decomposition on one of them and use OT to do multiplication by each bit. So if you know how to do OT, you know how to do multiplication. And if you know how to do multiplication, then you can do threshold ECDSA, because the core part of doing threshold ECDSA is multiplying shares of the secret key with shares of the nonce generated as part of the signing. So that's, I would say, the general blueprint. And if you break the security of oblivious transfer, then in many cases you can also break the security of the threshold signature scheme as a whole and recover the key. So for instance, if the sender is malicious and somehow learns the choice bit of the receiver, then you can then kind of learn the values that the receiver is using to multiply, which then kind of translates to learning the shares of the secret key. Okay, so what I'm going to do next, I'm going to show you like a general recipe for constructing oblivious transfer from Diffie-Hellman. The two protocols that we'll see are kind of, I would say, application of this general recipe. So just as a reminder about basic Diffie-Hellman key exchange, so we have two parties, Alice and Bob. Each of them chooses a random integer mod q and compute their public key, which is g to the a for Alice and g to the b to Bob, and send out those public keys one to the other. And then each of them both of them can compute the shared secret, which is g to the ab, and then they can use it to do encryptions and messages and so on. That's kind of the standard technique, and we assume this to be hard, assuming the computational Diffie-Hellman assumption holds. So let's say how do you build oblivious transfer by kind of applying that same idea? So here we have the sender that has two messages, M0 and M1, and we have the receiver that holds a bit. And like in Diffie-Hellman key exchange, Alice chooses her secret integer mod QA and computes G to the A and sends it to Bob. And then the idea is that now Bob, instead of sending just one public key to the sender, will actually send two public keys. One of them that corresponds to the choice bit, so this is B subscript C. And this one, the receiver will know their secret key. So you can think about that the receiver has the secret key B, and they know the secret key of one of the public keys, but they don't know the secret key corresponding to the other public key, which is kind of the other public key, B1 minus C. So you can think about like B0 and B1, and C is the secret bit. And the security in generally will hold from we talked about two notions of security, sender privacy and receiver privacy. So the sender's privacy will hold assuming that the receiver indeed knows the secret key of only one of those public keys. And the receiver privacy will hold assuming that those two keys look indistinguishable to the sender. And once you do that, basically what the sender will do, the sender will compute two shared keys. So similar to Diffie-Hellman, he'll kind of the sender will compute B0 to the A and B1 to the A, and then use those keys to encrypt each of the two messages, M0 and M1. And indeed, assuming that the receiver only knows one of the secret keys, they compute only one of the shared secrets and then decrypt only one of the two messages. That's kind of the idea of this recipe of how to build a Diffie-Hellman based oblivious transfer. So let's see one of those protocols. This one's called Simplest OT, and this is due to Chow and Orlandi from 2015. Here the idea is that again, Alice will compute G to the A and send it to Bob, the receiver. And what the receiver will do is will actually use Alice's public key as kind of a blinding factor. So in fact, one of the public keys that the receiver will send will be G to the B, and the other one will be A over G to the B. I'm slightly changing the notation relative to the paper just to kind of explain it in a bit simpler terms. But basically, you can think about the receiver sending two public keys to the sender, and the sender can verify that indeed the two keys multiply to the public key of the sender A, and then use as in the general recipe, basically use those two keys to encrypt the two messages and send them to the receiver. And the receiver computes the shared key and can decrypt. And in practice, you don't actually need to send two public keys. The receiver can send just, let's say, B0, and the sender can compute the other one just by dividing A by B0 to compute B1. This is to reduce communication. So let's see kind of why does this protocol satisfies the two security properties. So in terms of sender's privacy, so the sender's public key is G to the A. The receiver's two public key, as we've seen, are G to the B and A divided by G to the B. And so the two shared secrets are G to the AB and then G to the A squared divided by G to the AB. Now, assuming that the receiver knows B, he can compute G to the AB. That's kind of the normal way. And then basically to learn the other shared key, intuitively, the receiver needs to compute G to the A squared, and this turns out to be equivalent to breaking the CDH problem. So we assume this to be hard. This is all in the random Oracle model. So that's the intuition for the sender privacy. The intuition for the receiver's privacy is that the sender's public key is G to the A, and now the two public keys that the receiver sends, which are G to the B and A over G to the B, they're actually indistinguishable. Why is that? Because more formally, for any choice of the public key of the sender, every group element big A, then if the secret key of the receiver is chosen uniformly and random, then both of those elements are kind of uniform in the group and so are indistinguishable. And kind of notice this requirement that the point A must be a group element for this to hold. And indeed, this is one of the bugs that we found. This is in the MPC-TSS library, so this is an implementation by the authors of the protocol. Obviously, this is an academic code. This is not a production implementation, so I think these bugs are kind of understandable. But at least according to the repository, the authors did make some efforts to check this code for errors. So yeah, that's kind of the first bug. Specifically, the bug here is lack of elliptic curve point validation by the receiver, which allows the malicious sender to learn the receiver choice bit. And this allows actually also in a key extraction on the TSS protocol as a whole. So just kind of a background on how this type of bug works. So really, in broad terms, if we have an elliptic curve, this essentially points of field elements x, y that satisfy the curve equation. And if you want to perform group operations, so multiplication by scalar or point addition, you have, practically you have formulas that take in x and y. And the formula are only hold correctly if you actually feed it, if you valid group elements. And if you blindly apply the group operation formula on points that do not fall on the curve, then the result also doesn't fall on the curve. And this has been, a source for bugs in many types of protocols. So in particular, how would this, if there's no point validation, how would this work? So if the receiver doesn't check that the point A that they receive indeed falls on the curve, it's a valid group element, then essentially the two elements that the receiver sends back, which is G to the B and A to the GB, the first one of which is a valid group element, and the second one is not. And so the malicious sender, by sending an incorrect element A, can then learn from the two elements it gets back the choice bit of the receiver C. There's actually a little bit more complications because the actual protocol uses what's called a verified simplest OT, and it adds a little bit more steps. In particular, there's like a proof of knowledge of discrete log for this element A that the sender sends. And to actually exploit this vulnerability, you need to work a little bit harder. But the main point is that the point validation is missing. You can actually, turns out, forge this Schnorr proof and actually exploit the bug. Yeah, so that's kind of the first bug. If you want to kind of think what about the possible mitigations, so I would say the classic one is you need to do point validation. Any point you receive a point, over the wire. And the check is very simple. You need to satisfy that the point satisfies the curve equation. Okay, the second protocol that I want to present and also had a bug in it. It's the Masny-Rindle protocol from 2019. Again, I would first explain how does the protocol work. It follows this general recipe of constructing OT based on Diffie-Hellman. Here, both of the parties again have their secret keys, secret scalars A and B mod Q. And in here, the way that the protocol works is that the receiver will send two random group elements. One of them, RC, corresponds to the choice bit. The other one is kind of the non-chosen bit. And the way that the receiver generates those group elements, the R1 minus C is just chosen at random from the group. And then R sub C is generated by hashing R1 minus C, and then multiplying by this public key G to the B, whose discrete log the receiver knows. And these two messages induce two different public keys that again will be used to compute the shared secrets. So the first public key of Bob that whose discrete log Bob will actually know, this is just by the sender can compute it by dividing R sub C over the hash of R1 minus C. So just based on the definition of R sub C, this is G to the B, and again, the receiver will know the discrete log and will be able to compute the shared secret of that. And the other public key is computed exactly the opposite. So you take the sender computes it by dividing R1 minus C by the hash of RC. So again, the point here is that the sender can compute both of these without knowing, completely symmetrically, without knowing the choice bit of the receiver. And the idea here is that the sender privacy again holds from the CDH problem because intuitively the receiver needs to solve the CDH problem for this output of the hash function h of RC to be able to compute the second shared secret, and that should be hard. The receiver's privacy follows again here from the fact that the chosen group element R1 minus C and G to the B are both random group elements. And if they are indeed both random group elements, then also multiplying by the value of the hash functions is still a random group element. And so the sender just sees two random group elements and should not be able to tell them apart. So the second vulnerability is in the silent shard implementation. This is a commercial implementation that's actually been audited, and this is of the DKLS23. This implementation uses the Masny-Rindle OT protocol. Here, the vulnerability in general is that there's some incorrect sampling of the random group elements, and as a result, the receiver can basically the receiver leaks their choice bit with high probability of 7/8, and as a result, a malicious sender can recover the private key. The share of the private key of the second party. So to explain how this works, again we kind of need to look a little bit on elliptic curves. Specifically, this implementation originally used curve 25519 in order to run this Diffie-Hellman-like protocol. And the interesting part about curve 25519 is that the group of points on the curve, it's not a prime order group. It actually has a small cofactor of 8. What this means, and there's actually like a large prime order subgroup of size about 2 to the 56, and then there's like 7 more cosets of this group, basically as a result of this smaller subgroup. And so the idea here is that you can always you can test obviously if your element falls into the large prime order subgroup just by kind of exponentiating to the power of q. And the fact that there is this small subgroup, it creates, again, it's kind of a known source of vulnerabilities. Specifically, the problem here in this implementation was then, if you remember, like the way that the protocol should work is that the receiver should sample R1 minus C as a random group element in G. Here, the implementation, instead, what happened is that the receiver sampled it as a random 256-bit string. And so the way that it works is essentially instead of picking a random green point, as they should, the receiver picks any element, any 256-bit string that can, with probability 7/8, will be one of those red points. And you can easily test those two apart. And so essentially when it's a completely passive attack, so when the sender receives the two messages R sub C and R1 minus C, one of them will be a random group element, and the other one with probability 7/8 will not be, and it's easy to tell them apart. And so this is kind of immediately breaks the security of the OT. If you then want to break the security of the threshold signature as a whole, then the signing protocol uses 256 instances of OT, and of those 7/8 will be compromised. So for 7 out of 8 of them, the sender will know the receiver's choice bit, and then you're left with like 32 bits of that are unknown, but you can kind of brute force them to fully learn the share of the secret key of one of the parties. I should say there's another pitfall here that actually wasn't needed to exploit that one, but it's not sufficient actually to sample R1 minus C correctly. You also need to make sure that when you hash it, you also hash to the correct subgroup, and then do the multiplication correctly, right? So everything here needs to be within the prime order subgroup, such that the resulting elements will be correct. Because if you only fix the first bug, then R1 minus C, for example, will be a random group element. But if you hash incorrectly, or if you do, let's say, XOR instead of doing group addition, then RC might come out wrong, and you'll again have this pitfall. So how to mitigate this bug? Option number 1 is you can use a prime order group which doesn't have the small cofactor. So for example, you can use SecP256K1. The other option is to kind of do this technique called cofactor clearing, which is essentially you map random bit strings into the prime order group by raising them to the power of 8, which eliminates the factor from the 8 torsion. And again, you need to be careful doing this both when sampling, when hashing, and so on. like by the way, one other point that I wanted to make is that kind of there's this perception that curve 25519 is supposed to be safe and protect you from these kind of bugs. And I think it's kind of interesting to understand the details here. So if you look at the X25519, which is the key exchange protocol over curve 25519, it indeed mitigates the risk of invalid key attacks by accepting every possible string as a public key. So if we're running a key exchange and the other party sends me a bit string which doesn't fall on the correct subgroup, then the implementation kind of handles it. It does this cofactor clearing and thinks and avoids leaking any information about the secret key of the receiving party. But that basically this is handled in most implementations of the key exchange protocol. But kind of the more subtle point here is this is not built into the lower level curve 25519 libraries, right? This is only done in the higher level protocols. And when you're building other cryptographic protocols that use the lower level primitive of the curve, you don't get this for free, and you need to make sure to handle this. And I think this is kind of one important lesson to keep in mind. In terms of takeaways, so I think like one takeaway is that, as I said, there's some protocols that perceive to be simpler, but you cannot be too careful. You always need to do rigorous validation, even on the most basic primitives. I think, when you look at implementing a threshold signing protocol, probably most of your attention is going to be on the protocol as a whole because it's more complicated. It definitely requires a lot of attention, but you also need to look at all the smaller primitives, which are sometimes to us as cryptographers are kind of perceived as table stake, but again, the implementations are not always standardized and they're not always bulletproof. So you really need to pay attention to all the details. I think, as another point, I think oblivious transfer is such a primitive protocol for MPC, for not only for threshold signing, but as a whole. Maybe it's also a time to start thinking about like standardizing it, or maybe creating some reference implementation. Because I think, again, when you're going to building those protocols, most of your attention is going to be on the higher level bits, and so those lower level primitives are definitely also super important. And again, the classic attacks always make their way back, so need to check for them in audits and so on. If you want to learn more, so we have a blog post describing those attacks, as well as like a third attack also that I didn't get a chance to talk about. And yeah, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. Thank you.
Any questions? We have time for a couple of questions.
Maybe indirectly to the nuanced implementations, but where are the most attractive commercial implementations that you foresee for oblivious transfers?
So I think at the end, I think that the silence implementation is very solid. It's been audited, and if there's bugs, they're getting fixed. I think there's also libote. I think that's another one that's in C++, I think, and there I think we also looked at it, and it looked. I mean, those bugs we couldn't find there.
I mean, like use case. What are the scenarios commercially that you imagine it most widely used?
Sorry, I didn't get the question.
Like, is it exchanges that would be using this primitive, or like?
So I guess it's so. In terms of oblivious transfer, so one family of use cases is threshold signing, and this would be wallets and any key management system that wants to use threshold signing. In general, I think oblivious transfer is used for a lot of a lot of malicious security MPC protocols. So, for example, that's one way to generate beaver triples in some settings, and so on.
Any more questions? We have time for one more. Okay, then we can end the talk. Thanks a lot, Dima. Please give it up for Dima Kogan, guys. Come on.